This is Ray Keene on the D4-C4 repertoire for white, tape 1, side 1. Now, in a sense, it's an easier task to play with the black pieces, because white has to select a first move, either D4 or E4, or C4 or knight F3, and in most cases, the black player has any one of up to about 16 possible defences at his disposal. And black can select one of these in advance and specialise in it, and know his defence more or less inside out. Whereas the white player has to be prepared for more or less anything. Now, at the very lowest levels, this doesn't really apply, because weak players don't study opening theory, and the advantage of the first move is self-evident. And at the very highest levels, in Grandmaster Chess and the World Championship, it is assumed that both sides, both black and white, will have a very deep grasp of all the regular openings. So once again, the advantage of the first move becomes more apparent. But for medium strength players, for club players and county players, this doesn't really obtain at all. And this is the kind of player for which I'm aiming this tape. The sort of player who wants to play in league chess or club chess and is puzzled by the large variety of defences at black's disposal and really wants to have some line that he feels comfortable in against all the reasonable black responses. And the particular type of player in style for whom this tape is aimed is one who wants to play positionally but aggressively at the same time. And for this kind of player, the first two moves, the opening move, one, pawn on d2 to d4, followed by pawn on c2 to c4, is ideal. Now, one of the points of this way of opening the game is to take over the centre with pawns to control the centre and create a space advantage. And another advantage of this particular way of opening the game is that it's very solid, that the d pawn on d4 is protected. There are very few variations in which extremely sharp counter-attacking lines occur immediately, and white has a better chance of emerging into the middle game with a solid initiative than he does if he opens up with e4. So I'm going to start off this tape by dealing with black defences where black himself occupies the centre and meets d4 with d5, disputing white's attempt to gain terrain. And the five main branches of this, which I'll deal with in order, are the Queen's Gambit accepted, the Chigorin defence, the Slav and semi-Slav, the Tarrasch defence, and the Orthodox defence. And I'm going to start off with the Queen's Gambit accepted. So, on the board, please make the first move, white pawn on d2 to d4, black replies with pawn on d7 to d5, and white plays his thematic second move, the theme of this tape, pawn from c2 to c4. Now, in the old days, people like Tarrasch, theoreticians from the 19th century, used to say that black shouldn't, as they put it, surrender the centre by taking on c4. They claimed that the central pawn majority white gained after his inevitable recapture of the pawn would give him the advantage, and also white's development is speeded up by being able to develop the bishop from f1 to c4 in one move, recapturing the pawn. However, nobody really believes this dogmatic appraisal anymore, and the Queen's Gambit accepted is regarded as a highly reliable defence. There's even been a book written about it by Hooper and Cafferty, in which they call it the complete defence to pawn to d4. And it's the equivalent on the Queen's side of the Petrov defence on the King's side. It's really one of black's most solid defences. It clears away the centre and threatens to equalise very, very simply. And I personally have had a lot of trouble trying to find a way of getting the advantage against it. there seems to be something wrong with quite a lot of the accepted main lines for white. So, we'll play the second move for black. d5 takes pawn on c4. And now we have to find an approach for white. Now, the trouble with a move like queen to e4 check, regaining the pawn at once, is that later on the queen becomes exposed and driven around. White loses a lot of time. It's also possible to play a move like 3 pawn on e2 to e4, but after black replies pawn on e7 to e5, which is generally regarded as best, or instead of pawn on e7 to e5, simply knight on g8 to f6, the pawn on e4 becomes rather exposed, and my own personal researches have failed to reveal any really clear-cut way for white to gain the advantage. So let's put black's knight back on g8 and the white pawn back from e4 to e2. The most common move, or move 3 for white, is to develop the knight on g1 to f3. Black then plays his knight from g8 to f6, and then white plays e2 to e3. And now black has a number of choices. He can play his pawn from a7 to a6. He can play instead a pawn from e7 to e6 and follow up with his pawn from c7 to c5. Or he can play the very complicated modern line, bishop from c8 to g4. And the last of these is very hard to meet, and it's also extremely complicated. So what I've been looking for in this tape is a way for white to handle the opening without getting involved in complications which are conceivably much better known to the opponent. I'm looking for a way of fighting against the Queen's Gambit accepted, where white is on his own home ground, knows what he's going to do, and forces black to think for himself. So let's go back to the position after black's second move. d5 takes the pawn on c4. And the third move for white, which I wish to suggest, is pawn from e2 to e3. Pawn from e2 to e3. Now, a black player who wants to play the modern variation I just mentioned, with bishop from c8 to g4, is now going to be faced with a serious problem. Let's see what happens if he tries. After pawn to e3, black plays knight to f6. White bishop captures on c4. And now if black incautiously plays his bishop from c8 to g4, white simply plays his queen from d1 to b3, forking the pawns on f7 and b7, and black loses a pawn with no compensation at all. So that's one point of this idea. Let's replace the pieces. Put the black bishop back from g4 to c8, the white queen back from b3 to d1, black's knight back from f6 to g8, and the white bishop back from c4 to f1, and give black back his pawn on c4. So, the theoretically recommended move after e3, and the one that's given in the book by Hooper and Cafferty, little slip of the tongue there, is pawn from e7 to e5. Pawn from e7 to e5, which is a kind of counter gambit. If white takes the pawn on e5, d takes e5, black exchanges queens on d1, and then plays bishop to e6. And his queenside pawn majority is much more valuable than white's kingside pawn majority. And also white's king has been displaced on d1, and black has at least equality, and maybe more. So after black's third move, pawn from e7 to e5, white simply captures on c4, bishop f1 takes pawn on c4. And now I'll show you the variation that's given in the book by Hooper and Cafferty as being the best way to equalise. Black exchanges on d4, e takes d4, white takes back, e takes d4, black bishop goes to b4 check, which is the fastest way of completing his development. White parries with knight to c3, and black plays knight from g8 to f6. Now, think about this position for a moment. It looks as if white could play either queen b3 immediately, or bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and then queen b3 check. But in the latter case, black has the simple answer, knight d5, blocking the check and exploiting the pin on white's knight on c3. Let's go back. Put the king back on e8, the black king back on e8, give black his pawn back on f7, return his knight from d5 to f6, put white's queen back from b3 to d1, and the white bishop back on the board on c4. And in this position, similarly, if the white queen goes to b3 at once, black simply parries with queen e7 check, defending the bishop, defending the f-pawn, and preparing to castle. So this line of approach is futile. Please return the queen from e7 to d8, and white's queen to d1. However, once we've been alerted to the possibility of tactics along the diagonal a2 to f7 by the white bishop, we should regard this as something to be stored in the memory banks and waiting for this theme to crop up later in the middle game, where it may have more positional significance. So instead of this rash attack, white just develops knight from g1 to f3, black castles, king to g8 and rook to f8, and white castles. And now the most logical move for black, to help complete his development, is bishop c8 to g4, and this also helps to put some pressure on white's d4 pawn. And white responds with bishop c1 to g5, and now there are threats such as knight d5 in the air, exploiting the pin. And it's very dangerous for black to play the variation bishop g4 takes f3, queen d1 takes f3, queen d8 takes pawn on d4, because white can simply now play queen f3 takes pawn on b7, and white has the advantage. He has two bishops, and he shattered black's queenside pawns, and once black's saved his rook on a8, the white light squared bishop can move, and then white will gain more time by attacking the black queen in the centre of the board. So please return the white queen to d1, put black's queen back on d8, give black back his b pawn on b7, put white's knight back on the board on f3, the black queen's bishop on g4, and white's pawn back on d4. The most secure move for black in this position, and the one advocated in the Queen's Gambit book I mentioned, is bishop from b4 to e7, breaking the pin. Now in this position, the move discussed in the book for white is a very defensive one. It's a retreat of the bishop from g5 to e3, just to help bolster up the pawn on d4. But I don't think this is necessary, and in my opinion the right way for white to handle this position is to play his rook from f1 to e1, putting pressure on the e-file, and regarding the bishop on e7 as a kind of target. And there's no way that black can take on f3 and then take on d4, because too many of his units are hanging, the b pawn on b7, the bishop on e7. And the most sensible move for black, as far as I can see, is knight on b8 to d7. But now I think white gains the advantage as follows. Pawn to h3, bishop goes to h5, pawn to g4, driving the bishop to g6, and now knight f3 to e5, knight f3 to e5. And now we see there's pressure against the g6 bishop, latent pressure against the pawn on f7. There's the possibility of advancing the f-pawn, f2 to f4, to crowd out the bishop. And if black in this position takes on e5, white takes back with the d-pawn, and white is already getting a big advantage. He's got much better development, he's gained space, he's crowding the black pieces out, and the move f2 to f4 is coming, and black is really being pushed off the board. And he can play here knight f6 to d7 if he likes. And I think a good reply now for white would be bishop back from g5 to f4 with threats of e6, or perhaps instead of bishop g5 to f4, simply taking on e7, the black queen takes back, and now e5 to e6. And this is getting very, very dangerous for black. So please return the white pawn from e5 to d4. Put white's bishop back on the board on g5. Black's king's bishop back on e7. Black's king's knight back on f6. And white's king's knight back on e5. And I think in this position, this is the key position for the new variation I'm suggesting, white has the advantage. And I think that if you study this position, you'll find it's a very fruitful way to handle the Queen's Gambit accepted. One of the most annoying defences for black, and one that up to now has been regarded as a very good way to equalise. Now, let's go right back to the starting position. Please set up the pieces in the starting position, and I'll go over one more variation. So we're back in the starting position. White pawn to d4, black pawn to d5, white pawn to c4, black takes it, white pawn to e3. Now, let's see what happens if black plays knight f6. Black knight to f6, bishop takes c4, and now e6. And now we're getting, or we're going to get, an absolutely normal variation of the Queen's Gambit accepted. But at least white has cut out the possibility of black playing bishop g4, and that's very important. And the line I recommend for white now is knight to f3, black pawn to c5, white castles, black pawn to a6, white pawn to a4 to stop b5, which I think is very important, black knight to c6, white queen to e2, black pawn takes on d4, white rook to d1, black bishop to e7, white takes back on d4 with the pawn, black castles, white plays knight c3, and then black plays something like knight to b4. And this is a normal isolated queen's pawn position, in which I think that white has a slight advantage. White will carry on with something like knight on f3 to e5, and maybe bishop to g5, and he'll try to press in the centre and on the king's side, and black will try to blockade the white pawn on d4 with moves like knight from b4 to d5. So this is a standard position, and one that's fairly easy to understand. But the advantage of my idea of playing 3e3 is that you try to force black into this normal kind of Queen's Gambit accepted position, which should be familiar to anybody who plays the Queen's Pawn opening, rather than let him play the more adventurous and more dangerous bishop g4 lines. So e3 doesn't force black out of his own theory, but it does mean that you're playing on terrain that should be more familiar to you. So I think that'll do for the Queen's Gambit accepted. Let's get on with the next defence, which is the Chigorin defence. Please let's go back to the starting position and set up the pieces in their original places. After d4, black plays d5, white plays c4, Black has one continuation that's very unusual, hardly ever played, but has to be taken into account, and that's the Chigorin defence, and that is 2 knight on b8 to c6, favoured by the old Russian Grandmaster Mikhail Chigorin, and it bears his name since he was the most frequent practitioner of it. Now, there are many lines against this, but I just want to give one, very briefly, that I think is a reasonably promising one. White plays his knight to f3 on the third move. Black bishop goes to g4. White pawn takes on d5. Black bishop takes on f3. Of course, if black takes back on d5 at once, you simply play knight c3 and chase away the queen with gain of time. So, bishop g4 takes f3. White pawn takes back on f3. G pawn takes back. Black queen captures on d5. White pawn to e3, defending d4 and threatening knight c3. Black plays his pawn to e5. This is the main line of the variation. The white knight goes to c3, attacking the queen. The black bishop goes to b4, pinning the knight. White bishop goes to d2. Black takes on c3. White takes back with the pawn. Pawn takes c3. Black takes on d4 with the pawn. White takes back with the c pawn. And black plays knight f6. Now, this position has been met a number of times in master praxis. And by the way, black could also develop his knight on h6 or e7 instead of f6, but in principle it makes no real difference. This kind of position has often been played, but white has usually proceeded by playing his bishop from f1 to e2, and then castling, and eventually trying to set the central pawns in motion, perhaps supported by placing of the major pieces on the c and b files, perhaps the rook going to b1, queen to c2. However, I've found in my own games that the most effective development of white's king's bishop is to g2, not to e2, to g2. So white should play bishop g2. And if black castles king's side, or indeed queen's side, white simply castles himself on the king's side. And now there's a very powerful threat of f3, pawn on f3 to f4, opening up an attack on the black queen, and threatening moves like d5, followed by bishop c3. In the long term, you must also remember that if white gets to play moves like king h1, rook g1, and bishop c3, and then forces through an advance of his d-pawn, there's going to be terrible attack against the square g7. So in this position, in my opinion, white has the advantage on both sides of the board. He can either attack on the king's side or the queen's side. He has plenty of scope for both, and his own king is very safe. The bishop on g2 is not only aggressive, but also rather a good defender. And I think that this line, which it is possible to get against anybody who plays the Chigorin defence, is a good one for white, and the most recommendable one. Now let's go back to the starting position again. The next defence I wish to discuss is a much more respectable one, and a frequent appearer in tournaments at all levels. And this is the Slav defence, an extremely solid defence, favoured, for example, by the ex-world champion Smyslov, and one with which he very rarely loses, and even wins quite frequently against extremely strong opponents. And this goes from the starting position, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, pawn to c6. Now, let's take a look at the following line. White knight goes to f3, black knight goes to f6, white knight goes to c3, black takes on c4, threatening b5. White plays his pawn from a2 to a4, inhibiting this protection. Black plays his bishop from c8 to f5, white plays his pawn to e3, Black plays his pawn to e6, and white captures on c4. Now, this is the kind of position which I really don't like for white. Black's development has proceeded extremely harmoniously. His bishop on f5 has evidently not been locked in by the pawns. Every black piece can develop very simply. He has a number of strong squares in the centre, such as d5 and e4. And if black decides at some stage to play his pawn from a7 to a5, and then develops a knight on a6, he's going to fix a weakness on the b4 square, which could be very annoying for white in the endgame. And personally, I find the counter advantage of a white central majority not sufficient to balance this. I don't like this position for white. I know it's a matter of taste, but I've seen so many strong players simply fail to develop a reasonable initiative as white and then lose the ending, that I really don't favour this kind of position at all. And when I'm white against the Slav, I normally treat it in a completely different way. Let's go back to the starting position again. So, d4, d5, c4, c6. And what I like to do is to take on d5. C takes d5. Of course, black can't take with the queen because of knight c3. C takes d5. And now just develop the pieces. Knight b1 to c3. Black knight to c6. White knight to f3. Black knight to f6. And now the white bishop goes to f4. Now, if black chooses to lock in his queen's bishop with e6, pawn to e6, I think white gets a nice initiative. He plays pawn to e3, black bishop goes to e7. By the way, it could go to d6, but the exchange of dark squared bishops tends to accentuate the fact that black's bishop, remaining bishop, is hemmed in on white squares, while white's remaining bishop has the run of the white squares and goes very well with the dark squared pawn chain. So, black bishop to e7, white plays bishop to d3, black castles, and now white has a choice. He can either play h3 to preserve his bishop against exchange by knight h5, or he can just castle, and after knight h5, a move like bishop e5, or even knight e5 is not bad. And white gets quite a good grip on the central squares to compensate for the exchange of his bishop. No, this isn't the best defence of black. The most critical defence, we have to go back, uncastle both sides, put both the kings, black king on e8, black rook back to h8, white king back to e1, white rook back to h1, white bishop from d3 to f1, white pawn from e3 to e2, black bishop from f8, e7 to f8, and the black pawn from e6 to e7. So now we have a position where white's exchanged on d5, all the knights have been developed to bishop 3, and white's played his queen's bishop to f4. And black's most tenacious move is bishop from c8 to f5, trying to maintain the symmetry. White plays his pawn to e3, black plays pawn to e6, and now a move that's been very rarely played, but it's very interesting, and one I've played a lot myself, is the knight from f3 to e5. Knight from f3 to e5. Now one point of this move is that white threatens bishop f1 to b5, followed by something like queen from d1 to a4, with very annoying pressure against the knight on c6. And another point of the move is that white has a subsidiary threat, that is pawn from g2 to g4, bishop to g6, and then pawn from h2 to h4, harassing the bishop. And if black has to meet this with pawn from h7 to h6, or pawn from h7 to h5, white just captures on g6 and smashes black's pawn structure completely. So the obvious reply for black, after knight from f3 to e5, is to take it. Knight c6 takes knight e5. And now white recaptures with the bishop. But this is really a very difficult position for black. There are threats of queen b3, bishop b5 check, queen a4 check, and black's lack of development and lack of protection on these critical queenside squares could be very embarrassing. So please put white's bishop back from e5 to f4, replace the black knight on c6, and put white's knight back on e5. Another move that's been played against me quite often is knight from f6 to d7. Knight from f6 to d7, which is a kind of additional challenge to the white knight. And now white should play knight e5, takes knight on c6, black takes back, bishop from f1 to a6, threatening bishop b7, black queen to b6, and now queen from d1 to e2, defending the bishop. And in this position, white has some very annoying threats, for example, castles, followed by knight a4 and rook c1, putting pressure on the b7 square perhaps, and the pawn on c6. And so black's best move here, and one played against me by the Philippine Grandmaster Torre in a tournament earlier this year, is knight from d7 to b8, challenging the bishop on a6. Knight d7 to b8, white retreats his bishop to d3, bishop to d3, black takes, and white takes with the queen. It's obviously very dangerous for black to take on b2. If queen b6 takes pawn on b2, rook b1. So the best move is queen on b6 to a6, white takes on a6, black recaptures with the knight, and now white plays his king from e1 to e2. And in this position, white enjoys a slight advantage. It's difficult for black to get in the move c5 very quickly, because it invites a white knight to come to b5. White's bishop on f4 controls the b8 square, so black can't really occupy the open b file, and white's threatening things like rook on h1 to c1 and knight a4, perhaps pawn to a3 and pawn to b4, fixing the backward pawn on c6. Of course, white doesn't have a great advantage in this position, but it's very comfortable for white to play it, and it is not the sort of position that a black player would find very easy to defend. So, that's a brief idea against the Slav defense. Let's look now at a related line called the semi-Slav. Please go back to the starting position. Pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to c3, pawn to c6. This is the semi-Slav, and you'll see that it has characteristics of the Slav in that the pawn goes to c6, but also black has locked in his queen's bishop by playing pawn to e6. So although it's similar, there are some advantages in white's favour. But one disadvantage is that if ever white plays pawn on c4, takes pawn on d5, black recaptures with the e-pawn rather than the c-pawn, and makes a clear developing path for his queen's bishop to go to f5 again. And this is the sort of thing white wants to avoid. And I think the best line for white now is probably knight g1 to f3, black knight goes to f6, bishop from c1 to g5. Now, although this can lead to complications, I don't really see there's a very sensible alternative. If, for example, instead of bishop c1 to g5, white takes on d5, pawn takes d5, black plays pawn e6 takes d5, white bishop goes to g5, black plays bishop e7, white pawn to e3, black bishop goes to f5. And it's very, very difficult to prove any kind of advantage for white in this sort of position. In fact, I tend to regard this type of position as completely equal. the black bishop on f5 is much too active, and if white swaps it off with bishop f1 to d3, then most of the dynamism is drained out of the white position. So let's go back to the position after the third move, when white's played pawn to d4, pawn to c4, and knight to c3, and black's played pawn to d5, pawn to c6, and pawn to e6. As I said before, white should play knight f3, black plays knight f6, and now bishop to g5. Now if black plays his knight from b8 to d7, of course white could just take on d5. And if black takes back with the e-pawn, white plays e3, followed by bishop d3, and the black bishop is locked in, it can't get to f5 in time. So after bishop to g5, black has two main alternatives. One is pawn to h6, when I recommend the following line: bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, queen to b3, white queen to b3, and the threat is now pawn on e2 to e4. Pawn on e2 to e4, gaining space in the centre and hoping to harass the black queen. So black should probably play pawn d5, takes white pawn on c4, queen takes back on c4, knight d7. And then white should continue with pawn g2 to g3. And a typical continuation from this position would be queen from f6 to d8, so that the queen doesn't get stuck on this exposed square, bishop f1 to g2, bishop f8 to d6, white castles, black castles, and then white plays something like rook f1 to d1. And white's plan must be to restrain black from playing moves like c5 or e5, when his two bishops will come into the game. Well, black has to try and steer for this. But the advantage of the white kingside fianchetto of the white squared bishop is that if the game is opened in the centre, this bishop will bear down on black's queenside. And there may be targets on squares like b7 or even a8 in the future. And this is the opening of a game I played earlier this year in New York against the Danish master Iskov. And as white, I found the position was very comfortable and quite easy to play. And there are obvious plans like transferring a knight to the square e5 with proper support, or perhaps playing b4 and then playing a knight from e4 to c5. So the two outpost squares e5 and c5, white has to try and control these, and black has to try and break through. But I think on the whole the chances favour white. Let's just run through that again. From the starting position, white pawn to d4, black pawn to d5, c4, e6, white knight to c3, black pawn to c6, white knight to f3, black knight to f6, white bishop to g5, black pawn to h6, white takes an f6, and black takes back with the queen. Now, you may have wondered why white played queen d1 to b3, and why he didn't play his pawn from e2 to e4 at once. The answer is that if black takes on e4, d takes e4, and white takes back with a knight, hitting the queen, and apparently gaining a tempo, black has the move bishop f8 to b4 check. Now, there have been some master games where white's replied to this with king e1 to e2, hoping to intimidate the black queen and then gain advantage from the fact that the black bishop on b4 is a bit exposed. But it's rather an eccentric idea, and it hasn't really found favour with most strong players. The disadvantage of having white's king wandering around the centre outweighs the advantage of the slight discoordination between black's queen and his king's bishop. So if I were you, I'd forget this idea totally and play queen b3. Now, let's go back to the position after white has played bishop g5. This is really a critical position. Opening moves d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop g5. The critical move in this position, and one known as the Botvinnik variation, is pawn on d5 takes the white pawn on c4. Now you can, if you wish, simply play pawn a2 to a4 now, followed by pawn e2 to e3. And this is a pretty safe way of getting the pawn back. However, it's not the most ambitious. And the variation that I would recommend is as follows. After black takes on c4, white plays his pawn to e4. Black now protects his booty by playing his pawn from b7 to b5, keeping the pawn on c4. And this is the starting point for this very complicated variation, the Botvinnik variation. It looks now as if white wins a piece by playing pawn e4 to e5, attacking the pinned knight. But black has a resource, but it's a resource that leads to a wildly unbalanced position. And the main line goes like this. Black pawn to h6, white bishop to h4, black pawn to g5, breaking the pin, knight f3 takes pawn g5, black takes back on g5, bishop h4 takes pawn on g5. Now we'll see that white has lost a piece, although he's a pawn up. But the knight on f6 is indefensible. And the upshot of this variation is that black's entire king side is destroyed, but he hopes to escape by castling on the queen side, and then using the open files, the g file and the h file, for a kingside counterattack. Also, black has this massive phalanx of queenside pawns, which he hopes will be of use in the endgame. On the other hand, his position is very ragged, and it may be that he succumbs before he even gets to an endgame. Now, I can't possibly go into the complexities of this whole variation, but I can show you one line, one very modern line, that was elaborated in the tournament at Moscow, the Category 15 Grandmaster tournament at Moscow a few months ago. I'm speaking now in August 1981, which fixes the date for you. And this was a game between Pologaevsky, Soviet Grandmaster Pologaevsky, and the Filipino Eugene Torre. And it went like this. Black knight on b8 to d7, white pawn on e5, takes the knight on f6, black bishop to b7, white pawn to g3, black pawn to c5, hitting the rook on h1 at long range, white pawn to d5, black knight to b6. And now came a remarkable move. Pawn d5 takes pawn on e6. Black took the rook on h1. White played the pawn on e6 to e7. Black took on d1, queen takes d1 check, and white took back. Rook takes d1. Now, white sacrificed a whole rook for 2 pawns, but there's a very unpleasant threat of knight takes pawn on b5, with mating ideas on c7. And the best way of defending against this is playing the pawn from a7 to a6. And now, there have been some games with this variation where white's now taken on f8. Pawn on e7 takes bishop on f8 check, which looks as if it's forced, otherwise white's still a whole rook down. But that's not exactly true. After this exchange, white stays rook for minor piece down, and has some compensation, but probably not enough to win. And Pologaevsky introduced a totally new move in this position, and one that alters the whole theoretical complexion of the line. And that was pawn from h2 to h4. Pawn from h2 to h4. Saving his passed h-pawn, and hoping that his 5-1 kingside pawn majority will outweigh the loss of his rook. So, black saved the bishop. He played his bishop from f8 to h6. Bishop from f8 to h6. White played his pawn from f2 to f4. Black captured on g5, bishop takes g5, and white took back with the f-pawn, creating a very, very menacing army of kingside pawns. Black now played b4, pawn b5 to b4, trying to strike back on the queen side, and white played his rook from d1 to d6. Rook from d1 to d6. Now black has two choices. He can either play rook b8, as happened in the game, defending his knight, or he can take on c3. I'd like you now to take a look for yourself at the possibilities after b4 takes c3, and on the second side of this tape, I'll go into it more deeply. This is Ray Keene on the d4-c4 repertoire for white, tape 1, side 2. So, I left you in a very complex and tense situation from the game Pologaevsky-Torre, Moscow 1981, where black has the choice between rook b8 and pawn takes on c3. Let's take a brief look at pawn takes c3, which wasn't played in the game. Pawn b4 takes knight on c3, rook takes b6, pawn to c2, king to d2. Now, inevitably, white's going to pick up the black pawns on c4 and c2. There's no way black can hang on to these. And black's still hampered by the fact that his king can't really escape from the e8 square. If ever it comes out from e8, the pawn on f7 is going to be intensely vulnerable. And the mass of white pawns on the king's side will certainly become very dangerous indeed. Now, I'm not suggesting you should just play this variation without thinking. Just look at this tape and think, oh, well, that wins. You should take a good long look at it yourselves to convince yourself that Pologaevsky's play is correct. But it certainly looks to me like a very promising way of handling the position. And Pologaevsky, as a grandmaster, noted for his deep theoretical preparation. And if he relies on this variation, it probably means that it's strong. So, if you want to play this, take a look at it, but look at it in a positive frame of mind, and I think you'll find that the variations work out in white's favour. Now let's go back. Put white's king back from d2 to e1, the black pawn back from c2 to b4, replace white's knight on the board at c3, put the white rook back from b6 to d6, and black's rook from a8 to b8. So black played rook b8, and white played his knight from c3 to d1. And in this position, the game continued knight b6 to d5, bishop takes c4, and now black gave up his knight on e7. Knight takes e7, pawn takes e7, king takes e7. And here white has a choice. He can either play rook takes pawn on a6, or just rook to f6. And in both cases, he has excellent compensation for the exchange. The white knight comes to e3, threatening to go to d5 or f5 according to circumstance, and white has a nice advantage. Now, why do you think black gave up his knight like that? Let's go back a bit. Put the black king back on e8 from e7, put the white pawns back on the board on f6 and e7, replace white's bishop from c4 to f1, give black his c-pawn back on c4, and put the knight back, the black knight back on b6. This is the position where black played his knight to d5 and gave it up on e7. And in this position, white has an absolutely spectacular threat. And probably the enormity of this threat is what forced Torre to the conclusion that he had to give up the material to stay on the board. And I remember I was thinking about this game, admiring it after I'd seen it, and suddenly when I saw this position in my mind afterwards, thinking about it, I suddenly saw this unbelievable atomic threat. And I'd like you to switch off for a while and see if you can see what white's threat is. If it were white's move in this position, what would you do? So, let me show you what this beautiful variation is. White's threat, the one that persuaded Torre to give back the booty, is knight from d1 to e3. And clearly, if this knight gets to f5, there are going to be horrible mating threats on g7. So, black places bishop to e4 to pin down the knight. Now white goes bishop to g2, attacking the bishop. And the bishop can't withdraw because of bishop c6 check. So, bishop takes g2. White doesn't recapture. He plays knight f5, threatening mate. You see the black king is imprisoned. Black has to play rook g8. White plays knight g7 check. Black has to take it. White plays rook d8 check. Black has to take that. We now have a position where black is 2 rooks and 2 minor pieces up for 2 pawns, but only temporarily. In fact, black's completely lost. White takes on d8 equals queen check, black takes back, and white takes on g7, curtains. Rather a nice variation. Anyway, I can't possibly hope to go into all the complexities of this semi-Slav line, Botvinnik variation, but I hope that by showing you this one game, or the critical points from this one game, I've given you an insight into the remarkable dynamic possibilities white has at his disposal. Before entirely leaving the semi-Slav, I just want to go through one more variation quickly, which is unsound, but the refutation was not generally known until the end of last year, when it was discovered in the game Timon Ljubojevic played at Buenos Aires. And I'll just go through this quickly in case you should come across it. And it goes like this. From the starting position, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c6, pawn to c6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop to g5, pawn takes on c4, pawn to e4, pawn to b5, pawn to e5, pawn to h6, bishop to h4, pawn to g5, knight takes g5, and now the remarkable move, instead of h takes g5, knight f6 to d5. And Timon blew up the variation as follows. Knight takes f7, queen takes h4, knight takes h8, bishop to b4, rook to c1, queen to e4 check, bishop to e2, knight to f4, and in this position the old main line was queen to d2, but Timon improved by playing pawn from a2 to a3. And now there's one variation that goes like this: bishop to a5, queen to d2, knight to d3 check, king to f1, knight takes c1, knight takes e4. And this is a winning position for white. One reason being that black doesn't get to capture the white pawn on a2, which has slipped out of the way and gone to a3. So black's just left with a lost position. Let's replace the pieces. Put white's king back from f1 to e1, the white knight back from e4 to c3, the black knight from c1 to f4, the white queen from d2 to d1, put the black bishop back from a5 to b4, black's queen back on e4, and the white rook back on c1. So after a3, which is a theoretical novelty, Lyubovich played knight takes g2 check. The white king went to f1, black played knight e3 check, which is forced. Pawn takes f3, also forced. Queen takes h1 check. King went to f2. Black took on h2 check. White king went to e1. Black's bishop retreated to e7. Timon played his king to d2. And now black's position is quite critical. You'll see that although he's got the two bishops, and he's a pawn up, that his entire queenside army is totally undeveloped, and white's simply threatening to penetrate with moves like queen h1 or queen g1, followed by bishop h5 check, and maybe knight e4. White's whole army is threatening to gallop in straight through the shattered kingside, and Timon already considered that this position offered white an enormous advantage, and in fact the game didn't last very much longer. Lyubovich played pawn c6 to c5, which is actually worse than useless. White took on b5, black took on d4, white played rook takes c4. Now the attack starts on the queen side as well. Black knight went to a6, and white played rook takes d4. Bishop to c5, queen to f1, threatening horrible things on f7. Bishop takes d4, there's no defence. Queen f7 check, king d8, knight takes d4, queen g2 to stop knight c6, queen f8 check, king d7, and black resigned. After queen d6 check, king e8, king c3, white's bishop is unpinned, and the threats of bishop b5 or bishop h5 are quite decisive. Now, I haven't gone into this variation very deeply. I've just rushed through this game between Timon and Lyubovich, but it is an important one, and if you're at all worried by the Alasotsev variation, you should just check through this game, and you'll find a complete antidote. Now, let's stop with the semi-Slav and get onto another important defence, the Tarrasch. The Tarrasch defence. This goes d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5. And black usually contracts an isolated queen's pawn, but hopes to get counterplay in terms of open lines for his pieces, outposts in the centre, and so on. It's a playable defence, and people like Spassky and John Nunn have used it to quite good effect. What I want to suggest here is just a quick line against it, which is rather unusual, and gives scope for individual analysis, and avoids the main lines. And it goes like this. Pawn takes d5, black takes back on d5 with the pawn, knight to f3, knight to c6, pawn to g3. That's preparing to put pressure on the isolated, or potentially isolated, black pawn on d5. Black knight to f6, bishop to g2, bishop to e7, castles for white, castles for black. Now in this position, there are many moves. There's pawn takes c5, bishop to g5, for example, bishop to f4. But the move I like is bishop c1 to e3, bishop c1 to e3. Now if black takes on d4, pawn takes d4, white takes back with the knight, and he's already got an ideal blockading position, fixing the pawn on d5 and taking over the blockade of the square on d4. And I find this position rather nice for white. Put the white knight back on f3, replace the pawn on d4, and give black back his c5 pawn. Another move for black is c5 to c4, fixing the centre. But then I think that white can play knight f3 to e5, black bishop goes to e6, and now two choices, either f2 to f4, which supports the knight, which I think Bent Larsen has played, or, and I think this is also possible, knight takes pawn on c4, d5 takes c4, pawn to d5, knight takes pawn on d5, knight takes knight on d5. And I think in this position that the centralised knight on d5 gives white a slight advantage. Also, both white's bishops are aiming at the queen's side, where black has potentially vulnerable pawns. The white rook can go to c1, because black's pawn on c4 is rather exposed. And I just feel that in this position white's got a tangible advantage. Maybe not too much, but certainly enough to play with. So please put white's knight back from d5 to c3. Put the black bishop back from e6 to c8. Black pawn from c4 to c5. And now replace on the board the black knight at f6, the white knight at f3, the black pawn at d5, and the white pawn at d4. Another idea for black here is to play knight f6 to g4, harassing the bishop. But then I think white should just play his bishop from e3 to f4. And nothing dramatic has happened in this position, but black slightly underprotected his d5 pawn, and the knight on g4 is going to have to move back again eventually. Either white will chase it, or black will need to retire it. And I think in this position white can just play a normal middle game, eventually take on c5, play his rook to c1, perhaps play h3, drive away the knight, put the bishop back on e3 maybe. It's not a very well analysed position, and I think there's plenty of scope for original analysis. And one gets the kind of IQP position that characterises the Tarrasch, but without allowing black the long main lines that presumably he'll know quite well if he's going to play a defence like the Tarrasch. So this is just a suggestion, but I think it's worth thinking about. Now let's go back to the start again and look at another critical variation of the Tarrasch. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, c5. c4 takes d5. Now, we've taken a short look at what happens if black allows the IQP to develop, the isolated queen's pawn. But what about the Hennig-Schara Gambit? This is rather a fearsome prospect, and I know many games where white has incautiously been wiped out by this line. This goes c5 takes d4. Now it's possible to play queen a4 check here, but it's not really necessary. Queen takes d4, knight c6, queen d1, pawn takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop d7. So this is the main position, the main starting position for the Hennig-Schara Gambit. Now what white mustn't do in this position is play a move like bishop g5. It just exposes the bishop and also weakens white's queen side. What white's got to do really is to develop very cautiously, slowly and solidly, castle king side, and then get a counterattack going on the queen side. So the main line goes something like this: knight f3, knight f6, queen to d1, the safest square, bishop c5, pawn to e3, blocking the bishop attack, queen to e7, bishop to e2, castles queenside, white castles kingside. And now black has all sorts of hair-raising possibilities, like pawn to g5. And what white has to do is to react sharply. After something like pawn to g5, the best move is pawn from b2 to b4, followed by queen to b3, and then rook to b1, and maybe bishop to b2. And white really can't rely on the extra material in this variation. He has to counterattack on the queen side. But if he does this, I think his chances are quite good, because black's king is actually more exposed than the white king. It's on an open file already, and if you blast open the b file by playing b4, you really create a whole area where the black king has no totally safe refuge. And also the move g5 weakens black somewhat along the a1 to h8 diagonal, so the move bishop b2 will also come in useful. So after pawn to b4, black should probably take it. Bishop c5, takes pawn on b4. White plays his queen from d1 to b3. And if black plays his pawn from g5 to g4, white has knight d4, knight f3 to d4. Knight takes d4, for example. Pawn on e3 takes d4. And black can't play bishop takes c3 and queen takes e2, because white recaptures on c3 with check. So in this position, I think white has the advantage. One thread is bishop c1 to f4, cutting off the black king. Another move is bishop c1 to e3, just solidifying in the centre. And here, although the material equilibrium has been re-established, I think black is in more danger of being wiped out than white is, because his own king is more exposed. The lack of pawn shelter on the c-file is much more significant than the fact that the black g-pawn is already crouching in front of white's king. So that deals with the Hennig-Schara Gambit. I'm not really, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that white wins by force against this. I'm merely pointing out what I think is the most satisfactory line, and one that I feel should in the long run give white the advantage. I don't think that black should be able to give up a pawn for nebulous compensation quite so quickly in the opening and get away with it. Now, the final defence I want to look at after d4, d5 is perhaps black's most solid. It's the orthodox variation, one favoured by Capablanca and many of the old masters and modern players such as Geller, sometimes Karpov, sometimes Petrosyan, one that's very, very hard to break down. And this goes from the starting position, which I hope you've now got on your boards, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to c3, bishop to e7, or knight to f6, it's about the same, knight to f3, and now the other move that wasn't played before, either knight f6 or bishop e7. And if white plays his bishop to g5, black defends with castles, e3, pawn to h6, bishop to h4, pawn to b6. And my experience as Korchnoi second in his matches against Karpov and Spassky is that this kind of position offers white very, very little. It's extremely easy for the position to deteriorate into a kind of sterile equality. So I feel that white's most promising course is to sidestep the whole of this and develop the queen's bishop on f4 rather than g5. Let's go back to the starting position again, and I'll show you what I mean. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7, bishop f4, castles, e3. And the advantage of developing the bishop on f4 is that it takes away certain critical squares for black's queen, such as c7 or sometimes d6, and also it avoids exchanges that, with the bishop on g5, black often gets to move his king's knight, and exchanges occur in the centre, and this way the exchanges occur much less frequently. Now, the most standard move for black in this position is pawn to c5, black pawn to c5. But here I think white gets a slight advantage. He takes on c5, pawn takes c5, black takes back, and now white just takes on d5, pawn takes d5, for example, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, bishop to d3, and if bishop to b4 check, king to e2. Now, we've already seen one position where I condemned the idea of king to e2 in these queen pawn openings, but here it's much more satisfactory. The white bishop is already on d3, so the king doesn't block in any pieces. White's very, very well developed indeed, and the black bishop on b4 can be chased away quite quickly by a3 and b4. White's rook can go to e1, or even to d1 if white's moved his queen, and then the white king slips away via f1. And this sort of position is quite satisfactory for white. It was played, for example, in a game between Smyslov and Belyavsky in the Moscow Grandmaster tournament I mentioned, and the fact that black's d-pawn was isolated turned out to be far more significant than the slight displacement of the white king, and white won the game after a hard struggle. Let's go back again. Put the white king back from e2 to e1, the black bishop from b4 to e7, white's bishop from d3 to f1, and now replace these pieces on the board. Black knight on f6, black pawn on e6, black pawn on c5, white knight on c3, and white pawns on d4 and c4. Another variation, it's white's move, is d4 takes c5, bishop takes c5, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, and now just bishop to e2. That's to meet the threat of bishop g4. And after knight c6, white castles. And again, he has a slight advantage because of the isolated queen's pawn. If black plays d5 to d4, then knight a4 is very strong. Meanwhile, white threatens moves like rook c1, knight b5, and knight to d4. Or alternatively, knight e5, occupying the centre, or even bishop g5, putting some pressure on the black d-pawn. And this position was tried out in a game, another game from Moscow, by the way, Karpov against Belyavsky, and again, white got the better of it. And I think that this kind of position, where you give black a weakness, even though it may objectively not be very much, at least unbalances the position and gives you something to play for, which doesn't occur in the main lines after bishop g5. So often in these, there's just a series of wholesale exchanges, and the position dies out. And in this kind of position, with the IQP, the isolated queen's pawn, it's not going to die out. There's going to be a struggle waged against this possession of the isolated queen's pawn. And it may not be loaded already in white's advantage, but he certainly has a strategy to adopt. Now, before we leave the orthodox defence, I'm just going to show you quickly a game I played in a recent tournament in Denmark, which demonstrates quite how deadly this bishop f4 move can be if black doesn't quite get it right. So please go back to the starting position, and I'll go through this game fairly rapidly. I was white, and my opponent was the Danish master, Ole Jacobsen. d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, castles, e3, b6. Now, as I mentioned before, this is very plausible when the white bishop's on g5, but in this position it's much less convincing. I took on d5 and he took back with the pawn, bishop to d3, bishop to b7, castles, and now it looks as if black might have the possibility knight f6 to h5, but there's a neat trick. Knight f3 to e5, black takes on f4, white takes back, and if black now tries to complete his development with the normal move knight to d7, white's got a shot. Why not switch off for a second and see if you can see what this shot is? Well, did you spot it? If black plays knight d7, trying to complete his development in a very normal way, white plays bishop a6, which blows black off the board. For example, bishop takes a6, knight c6, queen e8, rook e1, and black squashed. Please replace the black bishop from a6 to b7, the black knight from d7 to b8, the black queen from e8 to d8, bring back white's knight from c6 to f3, put the pawn on f4 onto e3, the rook from e1 to f1, give white his bishop back on f4, the black knight on f6, bishop on d3, and there we are. Black didn't play that. I don't even think he saw it. But he played c5, knight to e5, knight to c6, queen to f3. One of the points of this move is to play the queen over to h3, and then attack against h7. So black tried to simplify. Pawn takes d4, knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, capture on d4, pawn takes d4, queen d7, rook f e1, rook f e8, bishop to e5. Now in this position, black must play queen d7 to g4, hoping for exchanges. I don't think he equalises after this move, but at least he slows white down. What black played was quite mistaken, and shows just how dangerous the white attack can be in this sort of position. Black played b5, pawn to b5, and now the attack ran on oiled wheels. Bishop to f5, queen to b7, rook to e3. Now if black tries to block the assault with knight f6 to e4, there follows queen h5, pawn to g6, queen takes h7 check, king takes h7, rook h3 check, and mate. Please put the rook back from h3 to e3, black's king from h7 to g8, the pawn from g6 to g7, give white his queen back on f3, the black pawn on h7, put black's knight back from e4 to f6. Instead of that, black played his pawn from b5 to b4, white played knight e2, and black tried to get rid of one of the annoying bishops with g6. White played knight g3, so as to meet g takes f5 with knight takes f5, and an obviously winning attack. And black struggled once again to be free of the loathsome bishop, so he played knight d7. There followed bishop takes d7. It's very important to keep the bishop on e5. Queen takes d7, knight to h5, threatening knight f6 check. Once again, I invite you to switch off for a minute and work out what the continuation is after g takes h5. If black takes the knight, g takes h5, white wins as follows: queen takes h5, f6, rook g3 check, king h8, queen h6, rook g8, bishop f6 check, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6 check, rook g7, rook takes g7, queen takes g7, queen takes c6, and if rook g8, queen takes d5 happens to defend g2. So let's get back to the game. Put the black rook from g8 to a8, black's queen from g7 to d7, the black king from h8 to g8, white's queen from d5 to f3, and now replace these pieces on the board. White knight on h5, white bishop on e5, white rook on e3, black bishop on c6, black pawn on d5, black bishop on e7, black rook on e8, black pawns on g6 and f7. So, the knight cannot be taken, and there is a horrible threat of knight f6 check, so f5 is forced. White played his rook from a1 to e1, black played rook f8, white queen went to f4, rook f7, white played rook g3, black rook went to e8. Now it looks as if rook takes g6 check wins, but it doesn't. After rook takes g6 check, h takes g6, queen h6, there's a defence with bishop f6, exploiting the fact that the white bishop on e5 is pinned. So, put the bishop back from f6 to e7, the white queen back from h6 to f4, give white his rook back on g3, and put a pawn back on h7 for black. I prepared it by playing rook e1 to e3. Black must play queen e6, pawn to h4, bishop to f8, and now knight to g7. Black has to take it with the bishop. White took back, bishop takes g7, queen to d7, bishop to e5, and now black's totally screwed on the dark squares. There's nothing he can do about h5, but the end's quite funny anyway. Rook e6, pawn to h5, queen to e8, pawn takes g6, rook takes g6, rook takes g6 check, h takes g6, rook h3, rook h7 is clearly forced, white took, black took back, queen h4 check, king g8, queen h8 check, king f7, queen f6 check, and mate next move. So, I rather liked that game. It had some nice sacrifices, and the bishop I put on f4 in the opening ended up deciding the game by radiating total power over all the dark squares. One more small point about the opening of this game. From the starting position, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, castles, e3, b6, c takes d5. If black tries to keep open the diagonal from b7 to g2 by taking back on d5 with pieces, by knight f6 takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, white can just play bishop on f4, takes the pawn on c7, and if bishop b4 check, just knight to d2, and black doesn't really get enough compensation for the pawn. So this variation simply highlights another virtue of bishop f4, that it puts immediate pressure on the c7 square, and white either ends up controlling this diagonal or using the c7 pawn as a target. Now, we've dealt with all those openings in which black resolutely occupies the centre after d4 by playing d5. What I want to do now, on the remaining space from this side of tape 1, is to deal very briefly with a couple of defences where black doesn't play d5, and he also leaves out the move knight f6. On tape 2, I'm going to deal with those defences where black defends against d4 with knight f6. But here I want to take a very quick look at the English defence and the modern defence, where black reacts to d4 and c4 with a fianchetto of either bishop. Let's take a look first of all at the English defence, on which I've done a separate tape in this series, and so has Otto Hardy. This goes d4, e6, c4, b6, knight c3, bishop b7. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with playing pawn to e4 here. The trouble is that after bishop to b4, bishop to d3, pawn to f5, there are many complications. A similar line goes like this. Start from the starting position, d4, e6, c4, b6, e4, bishop b7, bishop d3, f5. There was a game that started like this between Grandmasters Brown and Miles at Tilburg a few years ago, when white played e takes f5 and sacrificed a rook after bishop takes g2, queen h5 check. Now, all of these lines are playable for white, but unless you want to analyse them in great detail, it's quite conceivable that your opponent will know an awful lot more about them than you do. As I said in my introduction, the black player has a choice of openings with which to defend, and if someone's made a speciality of this, you're liable to be on a very sticky wicket quite quickly. Now, if you've got the time to analyse this and study the other tapes in detail, and work out the best theoretical lines and justify the various sacrifices white may be called upon to make, all well and good. If you haven't, if you just want to have a reasonably good line against the English defence that promises no disadvantage and leads to a very playable middle game, I'd recommend the following. From the starting position, d4, e6, c4, b6, knight c3, bishop b7, and now either the move a3, which stops bishop b4, and if knight f6, pawn to d5, followed by pawn to e4, or putting black's knight back on g8 from f6, and the white pawn back on d4 from d5, pawn to a3 on move 4, black pawn to d5, taking the pawn on d5, black takes back with the pawn, and then g3, followed by bishop g2, and knight h3 to f4. That's a very safe line. White runs very little risk, and there's nothing to know. Let's start again. From the starting position, d4, e6, c4, b6, knight c3, bishop b7. Another solid line is queen from d1 to c2, black bishop to b4, and now pawn from a2 to a3, bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3, and then continuing quite modestly with knight to f3, g3 and bishop g2. And one gets a middle game where white has the two bishops and flexible pawns, but black has some control over e4. And these positions are about equal, but they're unbalanced. Each side has particular advantages and disadvantages, and if you are prepared to invest a lot of time studying this very sharp defence, I would recommend one of these two lines as the most promising course. Let's go back to the starting position and take a very quick look at the modern defence, which is actually a defence I like to play for black. It involves the fianchetto of the other black bishop. From the starting position, pawn to d4, pawn to g6, pawn to c4, bishop to g7, knight to c3, pawn to d6, pawn to e4. And in this position, Black has a number of sensible alternatives. One of them is knight g8 to f6. That's the King's Indian. We'll look at that later in the next tape. Please put the knight back on g8. One is pawn to e5. In my opinion, this isn't so good. White plays d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8 check, king takes d8, pawn to f4, knight to d7, knight to f3, and continuing with moves like bishop e2, bishop e3, castles kingside, and rook to d1, white gets pressure on both the d file and the f file, and the fact that black had to move his king already is a big disadvantage. It's not a pure ending yet, and the king isn't very comfortable in the middle of the board. So I don't honestly recommend 4e5 for black. Please replace the black king on e8, put the black knight back from d7 to b8, put white's knight back from f3 to g1, the white pawn back from f4 to f2, black's pawn back from from e5 to e7, put the black queen on d8, white's queen on d1, white pawn on d4, black pawn on d6. A slightly better move for black on move 4 is knight b8 to d7. But here again, transposition to the King's Indian defence is not a million miles away, and white should probably just play f3, pawn to f3, and try to get into the variations I'm going to discuss on the second tape. The last move of any great significance is the move knight from b8 to c6, and I think this is quite a good move. I've played it many times myself, and probably the best reply for white is pawn to d5, knight to d4, bishop to e3, black pawn to c5, white knight from g1 to e2, black queen to b6, white queen to d2. Now black has a number of moves, including f5, bishop g4, or knight f6. But in all cases, white's most sensible plan is to play his pawn to f3 and follow up with rook to d1, attacking the knight on d4 and forcing its exchange. And in that case, white stays with a slight advantage in space and slightly better prospects.
Repertoire for the d4-c4 player, written by Raymond Keene, Grandmaster, read by Michael Basman. Tape 2, Side 1. So far we've looked at black replying with pawn to d5, and with black playing either a king's or a queen's fianchetto. Now I'd like to examine what is really the most popular method against one pawn to d4, and that is defences based on knight to f6. And these defences include the Benoni, Benko Gambit, Nimzowitsch, Grunfeld, King's Indian, all the most fashionable lines against one pawn to d4 and pawn to c4. Now, to kick off this side, I'd like to take a very quick look at the Budapest defence. Now, the Budapest defence doesn't have a very good reputation, but we must assume that anyone who plays it has something up his sleeve. That is, there's some line in the recognized variations that he favors, that he's trying to get into. Now, one of the main lines begins pawn to d4, black knight to f6, pawn to c4, black pawn to e5, white pawn takes on e5, black knight goes to g4, and now white plays pawn to e4. Black knight takes on e5, white pawn to f4. This position almost certainly favors white because of his extra central control. But if you're worried about this possibility, that black may have something up his sleeve, you can choose a quieter continuation. So reset the pieces and play again d4, knight f6, pawn to c4, black pawn to e5, white takes on e5, black knight to g4. Now instead of white pawn to e4, a perfectly good line is white knight to f3. Black knight from b8 goes to c6, white knight to c3, black bishop to c5, white pawn to e3, black knight from g4 takes on e5. White knight takes e5, black knight takes e5. Here white continues simply with bishop to e2, black pawn d6, white castles, black castles, white pawn to b3, followed by bishop to b2. And he has a perfectly harmonious development and some control over the d5 square. So as you can see, white has one or two good lines against the Budapest, and there's no need to get into fearsome complications. I've seen people do things like the following, and this is what you have to avoid. Let's go back to the starting position again. Play pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn c4, black pawn to e5, white pawn takes e5, black knight to g4, white knight f3, and now black offers a gambit, pawn to d6. White accepts pawn takes d6, bishop takes d6, pawn to g3, which all looks well and good. But then black has knight takes f2, king takes f2, bishop takes g3 check, winning the white queen. This is the sort of thing that you have to watch out for. Instead of playing pawn to g3 in that position, white should continue with pawn to e3, since if then black plays knight takes f2, king takes f2, bishop g3 check, white can move his king to e2, thus guarding the queen. There's one more slightly tricky line in the Budapest called the Fajarowicz variation. Now if you return to the start position, that goes pawn to d4, black knight to f6, pawn to c4, black pawn to e5, white takes on e5, and now black goes to e4 with the knight, black knight to e4. Well, by sensible play, white cannot really come out with any problems, and with the knight on e4, black cannot even regain the pawn. So if white plays knight to f3, black bishop to b4 check, and now either bishop to d2 or white knight from b1 to d2. The difficulties start for white when he plays too ambitiously to try and trap the knight at e4, with moves like queen to c2. Conceivably, these moves are okay, and if you look up the theory on them, you'll also find that white comes out with an advantage. But playing against a tricky line, it's often best to play a positionally correct setup and hope for a slight advantage in the middle game. In any case, the Budapest is a pretty rare bird in modern tournament play. A much more common line, and a far more annoying one, since it challenges white's right to the initiative, is the Benko Gambit. This, from the starting position, goes pawn to d4, black knight f6, pawn c4, black pawn to c5, and now white plays pawn to d5, which I think is the best move, since it gains space in the center, and it's also more typical of the Benoni and other defenses. Well, now black plays pawn to b5. a gambit with the idea which can be seen from the following sequence of moves. Let's make them on the board. White pawn takes b5, black pawn to a6. White pawn takes on a6, black bishop takes on a6. Now these moves might follow. Knight to c3, black pawn g6, white knight f3, bishop g7, white pawn to e4, black plays bishop takes f1, white king takes f1, black pawn to d6, white pawn g3, black castles, and white plays king to g2. Now perhaps by knight to a6, black gets play on the queen side, by continuing with moves like queen to a5 and rook f to b8, with a lot of pressure against white's queenside pawns. There are many variations like this, but in all of them black gets tangible counterplay. Now many people think that the best way to meet the gambit is to accept it, and I believe there's even an audio chess cassette which advocates the capture, which is called Bashing the Benko by David Goodman. But there are practical disadvantages to this method. In the first place, black wants to have his pawn captured. He wants to have the free piece play that it entails. And secondly, he gets to play a lot of moves very quickly and very automatically. Even if black gets into the middle game a pawn down, he may have a big advantage on the clock. Ben Larson says that the Benko gambit is a time gambit, a gambit designed to gain time on the clock. So it strikes one that the best way to meet the gambit is simply to ignore it and throw black back upon his own resources. If black is prepared himself to play a gambit, then white should also be prepared to gambit a pawn, just to take the initiative. And the move that I like best is that preferred by Viktor Korchnoi. This is the move knight to f3, which occurs directly after black has played his pawn up to b5. Now Korchnoi has used this on several occasions, notably against the Hungarian Saxe at the Phillips and Drew tournament in London 1980, and recently in 1981 in the tournament at Baden-Baden against the German Otto Boric, who is one of the most leading experts in the Benko gambit. Now let's look at one or two variations after this move. We'll start from the beginning. Pawn to d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, b5 by black, and now white knight to f3. Now if black takes on c4, he leaves the c4 square as a dead point, and white will just play knight to c3, and after black pawn to g6, white plays pawn to e4. This move threatens pawn to e5. So black plays pawn to d6. White takes on c4 with the bishop, and black goes bishop to g7. Now at this point white has got two choices. He can either play castles kingside, or he can play immediately pawn to e5. Black pawn takes e5, white knight takes e5. Black now has to castle. White castles. And now white will follow up with moves like rook to e1, bishop to f4, or bishop to g5. And it seems to me that white has a great advantage in this position. He has threats of playing his knight into c6. He's got concealed pressure on the f7 square. And with the rook on the e-file, he's got pressure against e7. And the pawn at d5 has a cramping effect upon the black game. This was more or less how the game Korchnoi-Sachs, Phillips and Drew 1980 went. Now let's go back to the start position, and we'll see how the game Korchnoi against Otto Borek went. Now this began with white playing pawn to d4, black knight f6, pawn c4, c5, white pawn d5, and black pawn up to b5. White knight went to f3. And now Borek tried to maintain the tension in the center by moving bishop to b7. He didn't capture on c4. Now, a few years ago, the game Kowalek against Miles from the Haifa Olympiad in 1976, which in fact is analyzed on the audio chess cassette Highlights of Haifa. This went pawn to a4 from this position. White played pawn to a4, black played pawn to a6, maintaining the tension again. But now Kowalek went badly wrong by playing his knight from f3 to d2. A very passive move, and one that's very hard to justify. A better way of playing after pawn to a4 and black pawn to a6 is, I think, to take on b5. A takes b5, a takes b5, rook takes a8, bishop takes a8. Now white knight to c3. This attacks the pawn at b5, and if black plays pawn takes c4 here, white will move his pawn up to e4, as we've seen before. So black reacts to knight to c3 by playing his pawn down to b4. But now the white knight gets a very strong post at b5, knight to b5. And if black plays now pawn to d6, which looks like a very natural move, white has the answer queen to d1 to a4, queen to a4, which threatens mate. And white can answer knight to d7. Well, how do you think he should answer it? Well, if black plays knight d7, white can try queen takes a8, followed by knight c7 check, though in that case he may risk his knight in getting trapped in the corner on a8. Or he could also play queen to a7, which has got a very strong threat of knight c7 check. All in all, this looks a very difficult position for black. Now, please go back to diagram 1. This is the position after black has played bishop to b7. And here, my suggestion was for white to play pawn to a4. However, Korchnoi didn't play this, but instead played a gambit, which is also very interesting. He played his queen out to b3. Black played queen b6, white knight c3, black pawn took on c4, white queen took on b6, and the black a pawn recaptures. White pawn came to e4, black pawn went to e6. Well, simply here, white bishop takes on c4 looks good for white. But instead, Korchnoi played another move. He moved his knight from f3 to e5. A strange looking move, but we'll see the point of it soon. Black played pawn takes pawn on d5. White recaptured, pawn takes pawn. Now black played knight takes pawn. And white moved bishop takes c4. Black knight took on c3. White bishop took on f7 check. Black king moved to d8. White now recaptured his knight. Pawn takes on c3. Black pawn to d6. And white knight to c4. Again here, white's got some advantage. The pawns at d6 and b6 are rather weak, and also the black king at d8 lacks a haven. In this position, black took up the challenge and played bishop takes g2. And after rook g1, bishop to c6, white bishop to f4, he was crushed rather rapidly. But even so, even if black does not take the pawn at g2, I regard white's chances as superior. So I think that this is a very good way of dealing with the Benko Gambit. It's one that keeps the initiative for white and makes black think for himself. And it avoids the terrible situation where your opponent makes his first 15 moves in half a minute, which can be very discouraging. I advise you, after you play knight to f3 against Benko Gambit practitioners, to watch their faces and see if they look as happy as they do after you take the pawn. Right, that's the Benko Gambit out of the way. And now let's take a look at a less aggressive defense, in fact quite a solid one, known as the Old Indian. It was the original version of the King's Indian defense, where black avoided occupying the center with his pawns too quickly, and it was practiced by Chigorin and Tartakova at the end of the last century and at the beginning of the present one. It goes like this. You have your pieces set up at the start position. d4, knight f6, c4, black pawn to d6, and white knight to c3. Now, of course, black has many moves here, including pawn to g6, which would go into a King's Indian. However, there are three moves which are characteristic of the Old Indian. One is the move pawn to e5, one is bishop to f5, and one is the move from knight from b8 to d7. Well, let's deal first of all with bishop from c8 to f5. Now, many moves say that white should deal with bishop f5 by playing pawn to f3 here, in order to gain time by attacking the bishop with pawns. So, let's see what happens if he does this. If white plays pawn to f3, black plays pawn to e5, white pawn to e4. Well, in fact, I disagree with the opinion that says that white has the advantage here. I think that black can play here pawn takes d4, queen takes d4, knight c6, queen to d2, bishop to e6. And though white has got a good bind on the d5 square, black has got perfectly adequate counterplay by continuing with pawn to g6 and bishop to g7. Black can later consider moving his knight from f6 and then trying pawn to f5, or advancing his a pawn down, pawn to a5 to a4. And I don't like the slight weakening of the white position, which has been occasioned by the move pawn to f3. So I don't believe the move pawn to f3 at all. I think it's one of those moves that's been recommended because everybody's recommended it in the past. Nobody's ever thought about it. In fact, I've been playing the move bishop to f5 myself, hoping that someone would play pawn to f3 against me. And when someone did, I won rather easily. However, white has a better move at his disposal after bishop to f5. Let's go back to that position. This is after pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn c4, black pawn to d6, white knight c3, and black bishop to f5. Now the best move here is pawn to g3, and after black pawn to e5, bishop g2, black pawn to c6, white plays pawn to d5. Now if black captures this, white can capture with the knight, and if black sidesteps with pawn to c5, then white can play pawn to e4, black bishop to g6, and knight from g1 to e2. White slowly finishes his development with bishop to e3 and castles, and then plays for pawn to f4, and black's bishop at g6 is going to get squashed out of play. So this is a rather unpleasant situation for black. Another idea for black from diagram 2 is to play the move pawn to g6, which I've played myself. White goes bishop to g2, and then black plays knight to c6. The idea of this is that after white plays pawn to e4, black bishop to d7, white knight to f3, black can now move his bishop back to g4 with pressure on the white center. And this happened in a game of mine against Carl Berger in New York last year. However, instead of playing the knight to f3, white has got a much better move in the move knight from g1 to e2. Now once again, though black isn't lost, and though there are some very complicated ideas in this position, white must have the advantage, objectively speaking, because of his space advantage and pawns in the center. Okay, let's go back to the beginning again and look at another variation of the old Indian. From the starting position, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, black pawn to d6, white knight to c3, black pawn to e5. Now white can play knight to f3, but after black plays pawn to e4, white knight g5, black goes bishop to f5, or even queen to e7. There are many complications in this line. So instead of knight to f3, I suggest the queen exchange. Pawn takes on e5. Black recaptures on e5, and white plays queen takes d8 check. Black king takes d8, and now white knight to f3. Well, here black can defend his pawn either by knight f6 to d7 or knight from b8 to d7. But in both cases, white gets a small advantage by playing the moves pawn to g3, bishop g2, and castling kingside, then moving the queen's bishop and playing rook to d1. Let's show you a sample variation. After white knight to f3, black knight from b8 to d7, white pawn goes to g3, black pawn c6, white bishop g2, bishop e7, white castles, king c7, bishop to d2, black rook to e8, white rook from f1 to d1, and black pawn to a5, white rook from a1 to c1. Now, as I pointed out in an earlier part of the tape, the fact that the queens have come off does not necessarily mean that this is an ending. The fact is that black's king is wandering around the queen's side, and this may become very uncomfortable for black. White has got threats like knight from g5 to e4, knight going from g5 and then into e4, or playing knight to h4 to f5. And he can even play bishop to h3, swap off the light squared bishops, and this will leave black with a dark squared bishop fixed on the same color square as his central e-pawn. And this might become a long-term disadvantage. I admit that black's position is not lost, and not even a lot worse. but white can retain a long-term advantage with chances of winning, perhaps in a very long game, but always keep the initiative. Now let's go back to diagram 3 and see what happens if black defends the e-pawn with his knight from f6 going to d7. This will later allow him to move his pawn up to f6, bolstering the e-pawn, and this is the move which is usually recommended in this position. Now white can play the move pawn from g2 to g4, not to g3. Of course, pawn to g3 is still possible, but this move is much more aggressive. And the idea is something like this. Black plays pawn c6, white goes bishop d2, black pawn a5, white now castles queenside, black knight to a6, white pawn to h4. And the plan will be to push the pawn to g5 and then play bishop to h3. And if black plays pawn to f6 to defend his e-pawn, white will take on f6 and then play rook to g1 and take over the g-file. In view of this ending, very few people will play pawn to e5 for black. It's much too boring for this. If two players are evenly matched, then white has got good winning chances in this variation. And if black is much stronger, white has got such good drawing chances that the black player probably won't touch the line. Now let's have a look at one more variation in the old Indian, which is quite important because of its transpositional possibilities. This is from the start position again. Pawn to d4, black knight to f6, white pawn c4, black pawn to d6, white knight to c3, and now black knight from b8 to d7. White plays here pawn to e4, and black pawn goes to e5. Now, in a later part of this tape, I'm going to recommend that the correct way to play against the King's Indian defense is the sameish variation with pawn to f3. But the sameish is much less effective if black can develop his bishop to e7 rather than to g7. So, if in this position we play as white pawn to f3, black plays bishop to e7 with no problems. On the other hand, if we play knight to f3, black can now play pawn to g6, and he goes into the King's Indian, and we can't play the sameish anymore. So, what I'd like to recommend here is the move knight from g1 to e2. If black now plays pawn to g6, then pawn to f3, followed by a sameish again. And if black plays bishop to e7, then we can go pawn to g3. Black castles, white goes bishop g2, black pawn to c6, and now white castles kingside. And once again white has got a very pleasant space advantage. The bishop at g2 totally secures his center, and it also makes it very hard for black to break out with pawn to d5 or pawn to b5 because of the pressure that the bishop exerts along the long diagonal. Well, this kind of pawn position is very passive for black. Usually black, if he has this pawn structure at c6, d6 and e5, would prefer to have his bishop at g7, where he could open up the center later and hope to create tactical threats along the long black diagonal. But the bishop at e7 is very passive. Well, once again, the old Indian defense is not one of the most common defenses, and it's very unlikely that people would play it against you. The lines where it is most attractive occur after. Now let's go back to the start position again. After pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn to c4, black pawn to d6, white knight to f3. And now black can play the move bishop to g4, which threatens to disrupt the white pawns. And then black can continue with either pawn to g6 or pawn to e6. And these are much more exciting lines for black to play than the other lines after knight c3. I've played these quite often myself. Well, this leaves us, before I get on to the really popular lines, with the so-called check Benoni. I'd like you to go back to move 1 again. Here we play pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, black pawn c5, white pawn to d5, and black pawn to e5. This leads to very blocked positions in the center, and black relies on his counter chances with the later advances pawn to b5 or pawn to f5. Many grandmasters regard the space advantage, or should I say disadvantage, incurred right at the start of the game as enough to put them off the whole opening. But there are others, such as for example Hartston and Mestel, just to mention the British exponents, who think that the breaking out possibilities are enough to justify the opening, and they don't object to this sort of cramped position, aiming to break out at around the move 35 to 40 mark and start creating complications when the opponent is short of time. Now, there are many ways of handling this old or check Benoni, but I think the most reliable goes like this. After black's pawn to e5, white plays knight c3, black plays pawn d6, white plays pawn to e4, black bishop develops at e7, white knight to f3, black castles, white bishop e2, black knight from b8 to d7, white castles, and now black knight to e8. Now black's idea is to play pawn to g6 and then fianchetto his knight, knight to g7, king to h8, and then bring his other knight round to f6 and into g8. And eventually he wants to play pawn to f5 when he has a whole barrage of pieces around his king. Now white will continue here, pawn to a3, black pawn to g6, white rook b1, black knight to g7. White doesn't waste time here moving his bishop to h6, because eventually when the other black knight comes around to g8, the bishop will just have to lose time or exchange itself. So at this position, white plays knight to e1, with the idea of playing knight to d3, bishop e3, and pawn to f4. Now this is an interesting point, because black now has the opportunity, which white has given him, to exchange off his bad bishop by playing bishop to e7, bishop e7 to g5. Now white plays bishop takes g5, and black plays queen takes g5. White plays knight d3, and in this position I think that white still has a slight advantage. One of his ideas is to play the move queen to c1, offering the exchange of queens. For once the queens come off, black's kingside pawn advance with pawn to f5 can be happily met with white pawn to f3, and the possibilities of a black kingside at pawn storm by pawn to f4, pawn to g5, etc. aren't very fearsome in the endgame. Meanwhile, white can operate himself on the queen side with pawn to b4, and I think he gains the advantage in this case. Now if, after white plays queen to c1, black declines the exchange of queens, then the white queen can travel to e3, and there it can support the advanced pawn to f4 if black plays pawn to f5. Then the center will be open, and relying on his slightly superior mobility that white enjoys because of the black queenside pieces, for example the bishop c8 and the knight at d7 and the rook at a8, they're not quite in the game yet, white should have the advantage here. Of course, this is just a broad structural outline of how to play against the defense. There are many other lines for white, for example, which involve castling queenside. But my feeling is that white's king on the queen side is much more exposed than on the king side, because at some stage black may choose to play a gambit by a6 and b5, and often these gambits, though they may not be completely watertight, if you make a slight slip against them, they can be extremely annoying. So it's better, in my opinion, to tuck the king over onto the king side, where the gambits really don't apply. Now, before leaving this check or old Benoni, I want to show you a game that I played recently, where my opponent played the line and tried to combine it with the king's Indian at the same time. And it also shows the dangers that black is exposed to when he suffers from this lack of space. I was white, and my opponent was Jonathan Mestel, and it was played in the tournament in Denmark in the summer of 1981. So let's go back to the start position. Now this game began pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn to c5, white pawn to d5, black pawn to e5, white knight c3, black pawn to d6, white pawn to e4, and now black played pawn to g6. Now this could be, say, an idea of transposing into the king's Indian, or it may be an alternative method of getting the knight round to g7 via h5 instead of the normal route, which is via e8. Well, I decided to stop a possible knight h5 and played bishop to e2. Black now played his knight from b8 to d7. I played knight from g1 to f3. And now, of course, bishop g7 would be a king's Indian sort of position, and bishop e7 would lead to the lines we've just looked at, where white continues with castles knight e1 to d3. Well, Mestel instead chose the move knight to h5, exploiting the fact that I have cut off the attack from the bishop onto this square. Now if white plays pawn to g3, black will be able to carry on with his plan, bishop e7, knight g7, castles, and eventually pawn to f5. And it struck me that the move pawn to g3 just weakens white's king side. So I decided to let the knight come into f4. After black's knight h5, I castled. Mestel played knight f4. I took it, bishop takes on f4. G takes f4. Now white played queen to d2, hitting black's pawn at f4. If now black tries to defend it with queen to f6 or bishop to h6, the move white knight to b5 is very annoying. So black defended the f-pawn with pawn to g5. Now black's threatening to take over the whole of the long diagonal with bishop g7, and also he's got moves like pawn to g4 in the offing, and then later he's going to play pawn to f3. So white had to take action to block the black control in the center, and also he wanted to take the sting out of pawn to g4. So I played pawn to e5. Black captured d takes e5, and now pawn from d5 came to d6. If now black plays pawn to g4, white's got a very strong reply. He can play knight to b5. Well, seeing this was coming, black played a subtle move, rook to b8, which gets his rook out of the axis of the knight fork on his king, and therefore the move knight b5 or knight d5 no longer threatens to win a rook. I'll just mention a variation here. If black, instead of rook b8, plays bishop to g7, then white has knight d5, and if then black castles, white will play his knight into e7 check, and then he'll play knight takes g5 with a very strong position. So, from diagram 4, black's move was in fact rook to b8, which I think is a good move. So I've played now to disrupt his pawns with pawn from h2 to h4. Now this is to clear up the whole business of whether black can play pawn to g4 or not. My plan here was, if black does go pawn to g4, I can go knight g5, black goes pawn to h6, knight to d5, bishop g7, knight c7 check. The knights are having a good time here, because after king f8 we get the fork knight g5 to e6 check, winning the black queen. Now let's go back again to diagram 4, and after white's move pawn to h4, we've got another variation here. This is if black plays pawn g4, knight g5, pawn h6, and again the key move knight d5, and now here black tries bishop takes d6, eliminating the pawn. But now white brings his knight into e4, bishop goes back to e7, and here comes bishop takes g4. And in fact black is totally crushed on the light squares. All of white's minor pieces have got ideal postings in the center on these white squares. Well, to find out how the game in fact continued, I suggest you turn over to side 2 of this tape. The repertoire for the c4-d4 player, tape 2, side 2. Well, we were looking at the game Keene versus Mestel, and we'd reached the position of diagram 4, where white has played pawn to h4. Mestel, in fact, didn't play pawn to g4, as we've looked at. He took on h4 with the pawn. G takes on h4. White now played rook from f1 to e1, black queen f6, white knight to e4, black queen to h6. White queen went from d2 to d5, and black played bishop to g7. White played knight takes on c5. Now in this position black absolutely has to castle, when white will take on d7, black recaptures, and then white plays knight takes e5. Now black's got some counter chances here, based on his 2 bishops and the threats of playing pawn to h3. But basically, after black bishop to e6, white queen to e4, black pawn to h3, and white bishop goes to f3. And white's got a massive centralization, especially after his next move rook from a1 to d1. And ultimately, he wants to play pawn to b4, pawn to c5, getting 2 connected passed pawns in the center. And although black's got some counter chances, I still think the position is in white's favor. So let's now return to diagram 5, where white has just played knight takes c5, and it's black's move. Now instead of castling, black played the erroneous pawn from h4 to h3, overlooking a combination. White played knight from f3 takes on e5, black knight takes on e5, white pawn to d7 check. Black bishop takes d7. He must take with the bishop, as if he takes with the knight there's a devastating check on the e-file. So bishop takes d7, white knight takes d7. Now of course black can't capture this because of the move bishop to h5 check or bishop g4 check. So instead he played h takes g2, threatening a mate on h1. This position looks as though it's okay for black, because if white now plays king takes g2 to stop the mate in 1, black will play queen to g5 check, king f1, and rook to d8. This leaves white very badly pinned. However, there's a flaw in all of this. I wonder if you can see it. Instead of playing king takes g2, but white basically has got a one-move win. See if you can find it by turning off the tape. Well, white to play stopped the mate by playing bishop to h5. This threatens cataclysm on e5, f7, and various other places. So black has to play queen takes h5, white rook takes e5 check, black bishop takes e5, and now white knight to f6 check, forking the king and queen. Black bishop takes knight, white queen takes queen. And now, due to the threat of rook to e1 check, black had to get his king out of the center and had to castle. And after king takes g2, white's position was easily won. He's got queen for rook and bishop, black's king is still very exposed, and his pawns are weak, and white duly won in about 20 or so moves. We now come to a defense which is one of black's most reputable. It's known as the Grunfeld defense, and it was invented in the 1920s by the Austrian grandmaster Ernst Grunfeld. And its insight is that black can allow white to build up a tremendous pawn center and then snipe at it from the flanks. Unlike the King's Indian and, well, Benoni's and other defenses, the Grunfeld does give black a lot of free piece play. And I've often found in the past that the Grunfeld is one of the hardest defenses to come to grips with. It's all very well having a large pawn center, but if you can't advance it or strike black down with it, it can become something of a liability. But in the last 2 years, a line has been developed which gives white good chances. It's a very active one and very fashionable, and it's the one I want to recommend to you. It goes like this, from the start position. One pawn to d4, black knight to f6, white pawn c4, black pawn to g6, white knight to c3, black pawn to d5. This is the hallmark of the Grunfeld defense. White plays c takes d5, and black knight takes d5. White pawn to e4, black knight takes on c3, white pawn takes back on c3, and black plays bishop to g7. Well, this is just one variation of the Grunfeld defense. It's known as the exchange variation, and as we can see, white's got a very large pawn center, but black's position isn't cramped. He's got a line for his bishop from g7, and he has played down the queen file, which he's been opened. Now, in the past, white's been used to play for an attack with bishop c4 and knight e2. And it was felt that the king's knight, couldn't go to f3 because of the pinned black bishop to g4, which puts too much pressure on the white d pawn, because eventually black wants to play pawn to c5 and put pressure on white's d4 square. However, the new idea is that the white knight can in fact be developed to the aggressive post at f3, and the pin isn't that serious. Also, the idea of putting the bishop to c4, white's bishop onto c4, has been questioned. c4 is perhaps too naive a square for the bishop. White's hoping there to start up a massive mating attack with moves like f4 and f5. But on c4, the bishop gets exposed to a black counterattack along the open c file. So, after black plays bishop to g7, white plays knight to f3. Black plays pawn to c5, attacking the center, and white defends the position with bishop to e3. Now, if black does play bishop to g4 here, white will simply play queen to d2, and the exchange of bishop for knight on f3 simply helps to strengthen white's center, which he can reinforce later with rook d1. And white also has the bishop pair. So the main line in this position is not for black to play bishop g4, but in fact a castle. And now white has a number of alternatives. He can play queen to d2, for example, and I want to look at this line first. White plays queen to d2. Black plays queen to a5. White rook c1. Black takes on d4, and white recaptures. C takes with the c pawn. C takes d4. Black queen takes d2 check. White king takes d2. Black knight to c6. White pawn to d5. White's going into an endgame, and his idea is that his pawns will cramp the black pieces and thus give him an advantage there. So after he's pushed his pawn to d5, black doesn't move the knight. He plays rook to d8, and white now drops his king back to e1. Now this line has been developed by the Russian-Armenian player Garry Kasparov, rising young star, and in this position black has got to move his knight. And if he plays knight to a5, white will get the advantage by playing rook to c7. Now on c7 the rook is very valuable in this ending. Well, instead of knight a5, possibly rather better is for the knight to go from c6 to b4. However, white still gets a slight advantage by bringing his bishop back from e3 to d2, and if knight takes a2, white plays rook to c2, winning the knight. So instead of knight takes a2, black should play his knight from b4 back to a6, when a plausible line is bishop from f1 to b5, black pawn to e6, challenging white's center, white bishop takes a6, pawn takes a6, bishop a5, rook to d6, bishop c7, rook d7, pawn takes e6, black pawn recaptures f takes e6, and now king e2, bishop b7, knight d2, bishop h6, white pawn to f4. Well, this is a very long piece of analysis, and it's all from a game of mine against the Czech grandmaster Jansa. In this position, black has got fairly good development, and the two bishops. On the other hand, his pawn structure is a mess, And if white manages to put his bishop on e5, and it effects some rook exchanges, then the weaknesses of black's pawns could tell. Also, it's difficult to get the black dark squared bishop into the game. However, this isn't the only line for white, and perhaps the simplification of the position which it involves doesn't appeal to you. So let's go back to the start position, and I'll show you a related variation, which is perhaps more exciting. Play the moves d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, white takes, black captures with the knight, e4, knight takes c3, and black plays pawn takes c3, sorry, white plays pawn takes c3, black bishop to g7, white knight f3, black pawn c5. Now, an interesting move here is for white to play rook to b1. This is another one of Kasparov's ideas. The plan is to meet knight from b8 to c6, which is a very natural and logical way to attack white's d-pawn. White will play pawn to d5 here. Bishop takes c3 check. White bishop to d2. Bishop takes d2 check. Queen takes d2. And if now knight to a5, then queen c3 hits the rook at h8 and the pawn at c5. Very clever variation. Let's look at another line. This is from diagram 6, after white plays rook to b1. Now instead, black can play, instead of knight c6, black can play c takes d4. White c takes d4, and now queen to a5 check. Well, here white can simply play bishop d2, and if black grabs the pawn with queen takes a2, then bishop to b5 check, and white's lead in development easily outweighs the pawn. There are threats against the black king and against the black queen, and this is an investment, a very excellent investment. Well, to be frank, I think I would recommend the move rook to b1 rather than the move bishop to e3. It's more aggressive, and there's far more scope for individual ideas and analysis there. Before we leave this variation, I just want to point out one interesting pawn sacrifice in the rook b1 variation. This is from diagram 6, if you have the position. And here black can castle kingside. Now white can play the move bishop e2, black knight c6, white pawn to d5, black bishop c3 check, white bishop to d2, white black captures on d2, and white takes queen takes d2. And now black plays knight to a5. Well, here white hasn't got the move queen c3 as he did in a previous line, because there's no rook on h8 to attack. However, he can start an immediate kingside pawn storm against black's weakened king position. So he can play here pawn to h4. Well, black's best defense here is almost certainly pawn f7 to f6, when white can try pawn to e5 with moves like pawn d6 and pawn to h5 in the offing. However, there is a rather curious trap which black can fall into if he doesn't play pawn f6. It looks like he can play bishop from c8 to g4. It threatens to eliminate white's attacking pieces, and it also puts extra protection on the h5 square. However, it doesn't work. After bishop g4, white has pawn h5, bishop takes h5, pawn g4, bishop takes g4, queen to h6, and black gets mated. Well, having dealt with the Grunfeld defense, I would now like to turn to an interrelated set of defenses, all involving the black kingside fianchetto and the move knight to f6. These are the modern Benoni, the deferred Benoni, and the King's Indian defense. And I'm going to deal with them all together because I want to recommend a line to combat all three. Now let's first of all take the modern Benoni, and let's go to the starting position again. Now from the start position, d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5. Now black plays e6. White knight c3, black pawn takes d5, and white plays pawn takes d5. Black pawn to d6. White pawn e4, black pawn to g6. And the variation I want to recommend against this goes like this. Pawn to f3, bishop to g7 by black, white bishop to g5. It's a very unusual variation, but one I've been playing for the last 2 years with great effect. Well, this is the line I want to recommend against the modern Benoni. Now I want to show you how it applies against the deferred Benoni, and then I'll actually start to analyze it under the heading of the King's Indian defense. So back to square one again. Now here is the deferred Benoni. This goes d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, black pawn to g6, white knight to c3, black bishop g7, e4, d6, f3 by white, black castles, and white bishop to g5. And now ultimately, if black wants to get real counterplay, he has to play pawn to e6, and then take on d5, and then white will take back with the c-pawn, and we're going to get the same position again. Now let's return to the start position again and see how it comes out of the King's Indian. This begins pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn to c4, pawn to g6, white knight c3, black bishop to g7, pawn to e4, pawn d6, white pawn to f3, black castles. Now bishop to g5. Black has a number of moves here. One of them is pawn to e5, but after white plays d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, black rook takes d8, white knight to d5, black loses material, so black can't play pawn to e5. Return now please to diagram 7. Another idea for black is to play knight to c6 here. Then when white plays his king's knight from g1 to e2, black can play pawn to e5, white plays pawn d5, and now white has the makings of a strong attack by playing queen to d2, castles queenside, and advancing the king's side pawns with g4 and h4. Well, after white's played his pawn from d4 to d5, black can play his knight from c6 to d4, offering a pawn sacrifice, which white can accept. On the other hand, white can decline it as well. He can just retreat his bishop from g5 to e3, attacking the knight 3 times, and after black plays knight takes e2, white can simply play bishop takes e2. And he's got a perfectly reasonable position. So let's go back to the position of diagram 7 after white plays bishop to g5. Now, if you look up this variation in the openings books, you'll find that the only move which is given any real credence for black is the move c7 to c5. Now this is the move which transposes. After c7, c5, white plays pawn to d5, black plays pawn to h6. This isn't essential, but it usually happens. And now comes the trick. You don't move the bishop back to h4, you go back to e3. So white plays bishop to g5, from g5 to e3. Black now plays pawn e7 to e6, white queen d2, black pawn takes d5, white c takes d5. Now in this position, white is not immediately threatening to take by bishop takes h6, because there are various combinations based on knight takes e4 and queen to h4 check. But in the long run, he will be threatening to play bishop takes h6, so black might as well play king h7 now and get it over with. In practice, this is what he usually does. King g8 to h7. White now plays knight g1 to e2, black pawn to a6, white pawn to a4. That move's very important. You must stop black playing b7 to b5. Black knight from b8 goes to d7, white knight goes to g3, and this is really the critical position in the variation. White's got a very simple plan. He'll play bishop to e2, castle, mass his rooks on the e1 and f1 squares, perhaps play pawn to h3 if it's necessary, and then advance pawn to f4 and pawn to e5 with a massive central breakthrough. Now I've played this line 15 times in the last 2 years, and I nearly always reach this position, and I nearly always win, and the people I've beaten in this position have included a number of grandmasters who've just completely collapsed in this position without any idea of how to handle the black strategy. Now, having given you a broad outline of what white should do, what white shouldn't do, by the way, is to try to attack with pawn to h4. This is quite out of place because it's decentralizing. Now, having given you an idea, a broad one, I'll just show you one variation where black falls apart completely, although he plays a number of very natural moves. And having given you some sort of inspiration in this variation, I hope you'll be able to handle it yourself. So, let's have black playing rook b8. He's trying to get in the move pawn to b5. For example, actually, if black doesn't play rook to b8 and plays queen to a5, which does threaten to play pawn to b5 because there's a threat, there's a pin on the white rook at a1. Well, if black plays queen a5, you have to stop that by playing rook to a3. That puts an end to pawn to b5. Several people have tried playing this against me in the past, and then they usually put their queen onto b4, trying to get counterplay. Most of them lose a piece or 2 pawns trying to get their queen out. After, for example, white plays pawn to a5, then there's a threat to trap, or threats to trap the black queen by moves like rook to a4. So I don't recommend queen to a5 for black. Instead, let him play rook to b8, white plays bishop to e2, black knight e5, white castles, black bishop to d7. Now, white doesn't want to play pawn to f4 straight away because this lets a knight in on g4, so he plays pawn to h3, black pawn to b5, and now comes the move pawn to f4. Well, this would trap the knight, but it does have a square. Knight come to c4, white bishop takes c4, black pawn takes c4. So black's opened the b file, but now comes the advance in the center, pawn to e5, black knight to e8, pawn to f5. Now if you look at this position, you'll see that black's totally and absolutely crushed if he plays pawn takes e5 because of bishop takes c5, which forces the rook to move, and then white will break through on the f-file. On the other hand, if black plays bishop takes e5, this is also unfortunate because white can then play pawn takes g6 check, and because of the pin on the f-pawn, black has to recapture with the king, and this, to say the least, is very undesirable. So, if you look at the position, after white has played pawn to e5 and f5, black played a lot of very plausible moves, yet he's just been taken out completely. And this shows you the latent strength of the variation, a very simple one to play in some ways, and one which I can heartily recommend against the modern Benoni, deferred Benoni, and the King's Indian. The final defense I want to deal with is conceivably the most popular of them all. This is the Nimzovich Indian defense, or the Nimzo-Indian for short. That goes like this from move 1, pawn to d4, knight f6, c4, e6, white knight to c3, black bishop to b4, pinning the white knight and thus preventing pawn to e4. It's one of black's most solid and reliable defences, but it doesn't run the risk, as so many other solid defences do, such as the Queen's Gambit declined with h6 and b6, of leading to rather boring grey simplified structures. It's a very lively defence, but reliable as well, which is why it's so popular. At Grandmaster level, it's probably the most popular defence against d4 and c4, and many people try to avoid it with, say, knight f3 on move 3 instead of knight c3, which leads to the Queen's Indian defence, because black then replies 3b6. But that defence is so boring I wouldn't dare to recommend it to you. So let's stick to the Nimzo-Indian, and there are many variations in the Nimzo-Indian. It's a very complex, rich defence, but the limitations of time and space mean that I must reduce it to 3 main lines. Now, I'm going to suggest 4 pawn to e3. I think this is white's best reply. And now I want to deal with the 3 variations from this position, the Hubner variation, the Anderson variation, and the old main line. Now let's have a go first at the old main line. This is where black occupies the centre, gives up the 2 bishops, and gets counterplay with his knights and mobile centre pawns. It goes like this. Black castles on the king's side, white bishop d3, black pawn to d5, white knight to f3, black pawn c5, white castles, black knight to c6, white pawn to a3, black bishop takes on c3, white recaptures on c3. Temporarily white's pawns are doubled, but they're going to undouble quickly due to black's action in the center. So now black plays pawn takes on c4, white plays bishop takes c4, and black goes queen to c7. Now this is one of the most richly investigated positions in the theory of contemporary openings. But the line I'm going to suggest to you hasn't been studied at all, which is one good reason for trying it on. And it goes like this. Bishop from c4 goes back to a2. Obviously white wants to get his bishop off the same file as the black queen. Now black plays pawn to e5, attacking in the center and releasing his queen's bishop. White pawn to h3, preventing the pin. Now black pushes on with pawn to e4. I've had this position twice in the last year against Grandmasters Romanishin and International Master Zultzman of the USA. In both games I tried to play, in fact I did play, my knight from f3 to h2. The idea of this being I was going to later break open the center with pawn to f3. But this idea didn't work. The knight on h2 is too far removed, from the scene of action. So I've now come to the conclusion that instead of knight to h2, it's better to play knight from f3 to d2. This keeps the knight a lot nearer to the main source of conflict, which is the black pawn on e4. Now it puts pressure on the e-pawn and also makes it difficult for black to play bishop to e6, challenging white's light squared bishop, which often crops up in the variation when the knight goes to h2. And in this position, I think white has good chances to get the advantage. His broad strategy is to play bishop b2, rook e1, and then pawn to c4, enlivening the dark squared bishop. And then ultimately he can bring his bishop on a2 round to b1 to attack the e-pawn. The knight on d2 can also reroute via f1 and then g3 in case of necessity, and a further point of this plan is to meet the move black pawn to b6 with the move white queen to e2, which stops the bishop from developing on a6. Now it's very difficult to analyze this position after black's pawn to e4 and the knight going to d2. There are too many possibilities. But the broad strategic outline I've indicated, I think, gives you the right ideas for analyzing in this position yourself and trying to find ideas that suit you. I've looked at it a bit, and I feel that white should get the advantage, and it's the only variation in this old main line where I can see any hope at all. And also, thankfully, it hasn't been very deeply analyzed in the theoretical sources. So there's a certain amount of scope here for individual analysis. I might add that the old main line isn't that popular at club and county level. In fact, even at grandmaster level, it's only Boris Spassky who really upholds its reputation. But it's never been refuted, and it's always liable to appear. A much more popular variation is one known as the Anderson variation, which has been very heavily favored by the Swedish grandmaster Ulf Andersson, and it's also been used a lot by Karpov, and this variation is a very tough one to crack. I want to show you a modern game in this variation. It's a recent one played by the Hungarian grandmaster Portisch against another Hungarian player, Pinter, Joseph Pinter. In my opinion, it's always worth following Portisch's ideas against the Nimzo Indian. He's really the most cultured and refined Nimzo fighter in action today, and his concepts against the Nimzo are always worth examining since he has to meet it so often. Now from the starting position, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop to b4, e3, c5, bishop d3, castles, knight f3, d5, and white castles. Now we get a characteristic move in the Anderson line, which is pawn takes pawn on c4. White plays bishop takes c4. Black now plays pawn takes on d4, and white plays e takes on d4. It turns into a typical isolated queen-pawn position. Now black is able to play b6, which is something of a success for him, because in some lines of the Queen's Gambit accepted, it's quite hard for him to get his bishop fianchettoed very quickly. So he plays b6, bishop to g5 by white, bishop b7, white rook e1, black knight comes from b8 to d7, white bishop to d3, black rook c8, white rook to c1. Well, this looks a fairly harmless position and quite playable for black. And now we get another interesting move in the Anderson variation. Black bishop takes on c3, willingly giving up the two bishops, but saddling white with hanging pawns. So white recaptures with the pawn. Pawn takes on c3. Now black plays queen c7. Now in this position, Portish came up with the idea of blocking the action of black's queen's bishop, and it seems to be quite a promising idea. In fact, the plan that Portish adopted in this game won him the best game prize, which was won in the 1981 Hungarian Absolute Championship. Now, Portish here played bishop to h4, black's rook on f8 went to d8. I might say that the move rook f to e8 looks more natural to me, but anyway, rook f d8 was played. Now white played knight to d2, and at this point black put his rook back on e8, which is the move I thought he should have played the move before. But it probably doesn't make an awful lot of difference because tempi aren't that important in this position. Now here white played his bishop to g3 and black played queen to c6, setting up an imposing barrage and threatening mate on g2. Now instead of retreating his bishop to f1, white played the move pawn to f3, which is Portish's idea. He blocks the diagonal and prepares now to transfer his knight back to e5 via a different route, that is via c4. Here black played his knight to f8, which is a standard move in this variation. White played knight c4. Black's rook from e8 went to d8. He had to do that to stop knight to d6. Now white came in knight to e5. Black queen e8. And I think it's fairly clear that white's got some advantage here. He's got his knight onto a very active square, and he's got an annoying pin on the black f6 knight. And to a certain extent, he's curtailed the activity of the black bishop from b7 to g2. Yes, in fact, white played bishop h4 here, pinning the knight on f6. Well, this to me looks like a reasonably promising way to meet this Anderson hanging pawn variation. And that is a variation which usually gives white a lot of trouble in gaining an advantage. Now let's turn to the Hübner variation. Now this is really the most popular variation in modern Grandmaster practice and in Master play. It's one that's quite easy for black to play, and he's presented an incredible brick wall to anybody trying to gain an advantage for white. Now let's go back to the starting position. I spent the whole of last year, well not all of it, but a lot of it, trying to find a good answer to the Hübner system, and I think I finally found something that looks reasonably promising. Again, it's one of Portish's ideas. The game begins d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, black bishop to b4, white pawn to e3, and black pawn to c5. Now this is the characteristic move of the Hübner variation. Black has no intention of playing pawn to d5 because he wants to double the white c pawns and then fix them along the c file as a weakness for the endgame, or possibly just as a static obstacle to white's bishops in the middle game. So c5 occurs, white plays bishop d3, black knight c6, white knight f3, black bishop takes on c3 check, white pawn takes on c3. Now black plays pawn to d6, white plays pawn to e4, and black plays pawn to e5, resolutely trying to fix the pawns in the center and preventing white from opening up the game for his bishops. Now one popular variation here, which I shall elucidate briefly, goes d5, knight e7, knight h4, black pawn to h6. This is to stop bishop g5. And then white plays pawn to f4. Black goes knight g6, a very good move. Knight takes g6, f takes g6, white castles, and black castles. White plays pawn takes e5 and black pawn takes e5. Now this was tried out in one of the World Championship games between Spassky and Fischer in 1972, and at first sight it looks quite promising for white, with its passed d-pawn, black's double g-pawns and white's bishop pair. But if you look at the position more closely, you'll see that there's no way at all in which white can get his bishops into the game, and in fact his pawns are totally blockaded, the d-pawn is, and it's the c-pawns which are in danger. Black can attack them by playing b6 and bishop to a6 and possibly knight e8 to d6. If there's an exchange of rooks on the f-file, which looks like a promising base for a white attack, then white's got no real activity prospects at all. In fact, in this game, Spassky lost fairly quickly. Now let's go back to diagram 8. Another idea for white, which was developed recently to avoid this fiasco, was to play the pawn from f4 to f5. Now black's got two choices. He can either take on f5, g takes f5, e takes f5, and then play pawn to e4, getting a passed pawn himself, but at the risk of allowing a white bishop to come to f4, which is rather a good square. Or he has another plan, as instead of capturing on f5, he can play the move b7 to b5, very sharp line. If white now captures c takes b5, black plays pawn to c4. And we note here that if white plays bishop takes c4, black will play queen to b6 check and knight takes e4, which completely shatters the white position. So after pawn c4, white must play bishop c2, g takes f5, e takes f5, queen to b6 check, king h1, queen takes b5. Now after white pawn to a4, black mustn't yet capture on d5, because after the exchange of queens, the white bishops would come to life very rapidly. Instead, he'd have to play queen to a5 with an attack on the c3 pawn and keeping up his pressure on the center. So this is one area of investigation in which white gained nothing at all. And if you want to find out a better way for white to play, the new Portish idea is given in the booklet which accompanies this tape.